It started as nothing special, just another
Would you
quiet
like me to
evening
pour you
after a
some
long
wine, my
week.
love?
Yes,
The sky
please.
had already deepened into that soft blue-gray before night truly settles in. The streetlights hummed faintly, and the air carried the scent of wet grass after an earlier drizzle. I'd gone out for a short walk, hand in my jacket pockets, trying to clear my head from the noise of work and the city. But then I saw it, the porch light next door, glowing warmly through the dimness. That house had been a familiar shape in my memories. It used to belong to my friend's family, the same place where we spent summer skateboarding until dark, always welcomed inside with lemonade and kind words. Now, years later, I was living just a few doors away again. I didn't expect anyone to remember me, but when the front door opened and she stepped out, my friend's mother, Claire, I froze. She looked almost exactly as I remembered her, only softer, somehow. 42 now, maybe, her dark hair falling loose over her shoulders, a few silver strands catching the porch light. There were faint smile lines near her eyes, the kind that come from warmth, not wear. She wore a long cardigan, open over a simple white blouse and jeans, her posture relaxed yet elegant. When she saw me, her expression shifted from surprise to genuine affection. "Wait, is that you?" she said, her voice carrying that same warmth I remembered from years ago. I smiled, awkwardly brushing back my hair. "Yeah, it's been a while." She laughed, the sound easy and familiar, and leaned against the doorframe. "I'll say, you look grown up." The compliment landed somewhere deeper than it should have. I told her I'd moved back recently, just renting a small place nearby. She nodded thoughtfully, the light catching her eyes, dark brown and full of something unspoken, maybe nostalgia, maybe curiosity. Then, almost as if it were the most natural thing in the world, she said, "Come in for a bit, if you've got time." I was just making coffee. Inside, the house felt smaller than I remembered, but warmer too. The faint scent of cinnamon lingered in the air, mixed with rain and something floral. Her perfume. Maybe a few framed photos lined the walls. Family vacations. Her husband smiling beside her. Her son, my old friend, now older, distant, living elsewhere. We sat at the kitchen table, the space glowing softly under warm yellow light. She poured coffee for both of us, her movements graceful, unhurried. "It's funny," she said, "how people drift away and somehow find their way back again." I nodded, looking at her hands as she stirred her cup. They were steady, elegant, the kind of hands that made even simple gestures seem meaningful. The moment stretched quietly between us, two familiar strangers, sitting in the comfort of shared memory, unaware that the night was already changing everything. Outside, the rain began again, light, rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat. By the time the conversation drifted into lighter tones again, the coffee had long gone cold. Claire leaned back slightly, her elbow resting on the table, chin balanced delicately in her hand. The small creases near her eyes deepened when she smiled, a smile that wasn't wide or showy, but soft, patient, like someone who had learned to measure joy carefully. I didn't realize I'd been watching her too long until she looked up and caught me doing it. For a brief second, she didn't look away, and something unspoken passed between us. Not an invitation, not yet, but an understanding that the night had started to mean something else entirely. The rain outside had stopped, leaving only the faint shimmer of droplets on the window. The air smelled clean, like new beginnings and things you shouldn't name. The house had grown quiet. Even the refrigerator hum felt distant. I remember thinking how strange it was that silence could feel so full. Claire stood to gather the mugs, her movements unhurried. She spoke as she turned toward the counter. "You know, it's nice having someone to talk to again," she said, her tone light, but her back slightly tense, as if she was afraid she'd said too much. I smiled faintly. "You make it sound like you've been alone." Her hands paused above the sink, then lowered slowly. When she turned around, her expression was calm, but her eyes gave her away, a flicker of loneliness, brief but real. "Maybe I've been," she said softly. Then, with a quiet breath, she added, "My husband's out till morning." The words hung there. Not heavy, not playful, just true. but they changed the air instantly. For a second, I didn't speak. The sound of the rain starting up again filled the space between us, light and steady. I could feel my pulse in my throat, in my fingertips. There was a shift, not in what was happening, but in how it felt. The room seemed smaller, the light warmer. I wanted to look away, to laugh, to say something to cut through the sudden tension. But I couldn't. She wasn't flirting. She wasn't teasing. She was confessing in her own quiet way. When she turned back toward the counter, her shoulders rose and fell in a sigh that carried more meaning than any words could. "It's strange," she said, still facing away. "Sometimes the silence gets so loud, you start to fill it with memories that never happened." That line stayed with me. She turned again, smiling faintly, her gaze soft. "You don't have to stay long," she added, voice lighter now. And I should have stood up, thanked her for the coffee, and left. But instead, I stayed seated, unable to look away from the way the light framed her dark hair catching small glints of gold, the calm strength in her posture, the loneliness she tried so hard to hide. It wasn't about attraction, not yet. It was about something simpler, deeper. The quiet pull between two people who hadn't realized how much they needed to be seen. And with that one smile, one line, the night stopped feeling ordinary. It had changed, though neither of us dared admit it. The kitchen was bathed in the kind of light that makes everything seem softer, not bright, just steady, like it wanted to stay out of the way. The faint hum of the refrigerator filled the quiet between our words. A small clock ticked on the wall. I hadn't sat in that room in almost a decade, and yet something about it still felt like home. Claire, though it still felt strange to think of her by name, sat across from me, one leg tucked loosely beneath the other, a casual posture that carried the ease of someone who'd once known me as a kid and now wasn't quite sure what to make of me as an adult. She had that calm confidence people gain with time, the kind that made you listen even when she wasn't trying to say anything profound. At first, we talked about harmless things. The neighborhood, how much had changed, the new families that had moved in. She asked about my parents, about work, about life. I answered lightly at first, but as the minutes passed, the distance between polite small talk and something more honest began to narrow. She mentioned her husband in passing, always politely, never bitterly, but the way she hesitated before his name said more than the words that followed. "He's been traveling a lot lately," she said, glancing briefly toward the window. "Work keeps him busy. I suppose that's just how it is after 20 years. Her tone wasn't resentful, more like she was trying to convince herself that the emptiness left behind was normal. I found myself studying her as she spoke. The way she held her coffee mug with both hands, as if grounding herself in its warmth. The faint curve of a smile that appeared and vanished whenever she remembered something fond. There was grace in everything she did, not practiced, just natural. When she looked back at me, her gaze lingered for a moment longer than before. "You've changed a lot," she said. "You used to trip over everything, remember?" I laughed. "Yeah, I guess I've learned to stay on my feet." Her laughter joined mine, quiet, genuine. It filled the room with something easy, something familiar. And for a fleeting second, the years between us felt like they'd folded away. When the laughter faded, silence returned, but not the uncomfortable kind. Just stillness. She poured more coffee, and as she handed me the mug, our fingers brushed. A small, accidental touch, but it carried warmth, and for a heartbeat, neither of us moved. She pulled her hand back gently, pretending to adjust her sleeve, though her eyes didn't leave mine. There was no awkwardness, only awareness. We talked until the clock struck 10. Outside, the rain softened into mist. Inside, her voice lowered, slower now, as though the night itself had made room for us to speak freely. I didn't know it then, but somewhere between the stories and the pauses, between the shared laughter and the quiet looks, the air around us had begun to shift, just slightly, but enough to change everything that would follow. I remember thinking, this is the moment to leave. The moment to stand, thank her for the coffee, and walk out into the rain before it became something else entirely. But I didn't. Instead, I found myself still sitting there, caught between reason and something quieter, more human. Claire leaned against the counter now, arms folded loosely, eyes on the dark window rather than me. The reflection of her face shimmered faintly in the glass, distant and soft. "It's funny," she said after a long pause, "how a house can be full of things and still feel empty." Her tone wasn't bitter, just tired, the kind of tired that sinks deeper than sleep can fix. I stood then, not to leave, but to rinse my cup in the sink beside her. "Empty how?" I asked gently. She glanced at me, and her smile was small, almost apologetic. "You'll understand one day. You build a life, and it looks perfect from the outside. But some nights you realize you're just living next to someone, not with them." There was no drama in her words, no plea for sympathy, just honesty. The kind of honesty that makes you forget about everything else. I leaned against the counter a few feet away, careful not to crowd her, but close enough that I could see the slight tremble in her hands as she tucked her hair behind her ear. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was dense, thick with the things neither of us could say. After a moment, she exhaled quietly. "You probably think I'm just complaining." "I don't," I said. "I think you needed to say it out loud." Her lips curved, not into a smile, but something softer, gratitude. "Maybe. You always listen well, even when you were younger." The words stirred something I couldn't quite name. Familiarity, protectiveness, maybe even admiration. She moved to refill her glass with water, but her sleeve brushed my arm as she passed. It was such a small touch, but I felt it like a spark, subtle yet impossible to ignore. The rain outside grew steadier, its rhythm echoing faintly against the kitchen windows. Somewhere in the distance, a car, door shut, a reminder that the world still existed beyond that house, though neither of us felt part of it just then. "You should probably head home before it gets worse," she said eventually, voice soft, almost unsure. I looked toward the door, then back at her. "Do you want me to?" Her breath caught, barely perceptible but real. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked at the floor, one hand gripping her glass, the other resting lightly on the counter. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet. "I don't know." And somehow, that felt more honest than anything else she could have said. I nodded slowly, understanding what she couldn't put into words. This wasn't about crossing lines or making choices. It was about two people standing at the edge of something fragile, knowing that one more step could change everything, yet neither willing to move back. The clock ticked once, the sound sharp and clear in the stillness. Neither of us spoke again, but in that silence, the weight of staying pressed down on both of us, heavy, electric, and heartbreakingly human. The rain slowed again, leaving behind only the sound of droplets sliding down the kitchen window. Time seemed to move differently inside that house. Minutes stretching, hearts catching up to words that hadn't been spoken. Claire sighed quietly and reached for the cabinet. "I think I've had enough coffee," she said, almost laughing at herself. "Would you like some wine instead?" I hesitated, but the look in her eyes wasn't mischief. It was invitation in its gentlest form, an attempt to keep the night from slipping back into loneliness. "Sure," I said, my voice lower than I meant. She poured 2 glasses and joined me in the living room. The lights there were dimmer, warmer, softened by the glow of a single lamp in the corner. The couch creaked softly as she sat down beside me, a few inches of polite distance between us that felt both too close and not close enough. She lifted her glass, her fingers delicate around the stem. "To unexpected company," she said. I smiled, meeting her eyes for a moment that lasted just a little too long. "To old neighbors," I replied. Our glasses touched lightly, the sound small but clear. The wine loosened the conversation, made it easier to drift from small talk into things that mattered. She told me about the art classes she used to take before life became too busy, how she'd always meant to start again. I told her about my work, how I sometimes felt like I was living on autopilot. "You ever feel like you missed your chance at something?" she asked suddenly. "Every day," I said without thinking. She smiled faintly at that, an understanding smile, not pitying, not sad. Her fingers rested on her knee, then brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear. The movement was small, but I noticed the way her hand lingered for a second, the way she drew a quiet breath before looking at me again. I I used to think feeling alive was something that just happened to you, she said softly. Now I think it's something you have to let yourself feel, even if it's just for a moment. Her words hung between us like warm air. I nodded, not trusting myself to answer. When she set her glass down, her hand grazed mine on the arm of the couch. So slight, I could have pretended it was an accident. But neither of us moved away. Her touch was steady, warm. It wasn't bold or searching. It was quiet, like saying I understand without speaking it out loud. After a moment, she pulled her hand back gently, eyes lowering. Sorry, she murmured, almost to herself. You don't have to be, I said. The silence after that felt different. Not awkward, just real. The kind of silence where two people finally run out of things to hide behind. She leaned back, exhaling softly. You're easy to talk to, she said, and I couldn't tell if she meant it as a compliment or a confession. Her voice had that tremor again, the one that made me want to reach out but not risk breaking whatever fragile trust we had built. And as the clock ticked past midnight, I realized it wasn't the wine or the rain or the loneliness that kept me there. It was her, the way she spoke, the way she listened, the way she made the quiet feel alive again. And maybe deep down she knew that too. Midnight had come and gone without either of us noticing. The rain had stopped completely now, leaving only the faint whisper of wind brushing against the windows. The house felt suspended in its own stillness, like the rest of the world had gone to sleep, leaving us in a space between what was right and what was real. Claire stood slowly, gathering the half-empty glasses. I should probably clean these up, she said quietly, though her voice lacked conviction. Her hand trembled slightly as she lifted the glasses from the table. I stood too, meaning to help, but when I reached out, our hands met on the same glass. Her fingers rested over mine for a moment, just long enough for both of us to forget what we were doing. The glass tilted slightly, catching a shimmer of light from the lamp, and I could feel the warmth of her skin through the coolness of the glass. Neither of us moved. The silence thickened, humming with something alive, something that couldn't be spoken. She finally let go of the glass, setting it down carefully on the counter. Her voice was barely a whisper. You should probably go before it gets harder. I nodded slowly, but didn't move toward the door. Then tell me to leave, I said, my tone steady but soft. Her breath caught. She turned toward me, eyes meeting mine with a kind of vulnerability I hadn't seen before. Not the poised, graceful calm she wore so naturally, but something raw and unguarded. I can't, she said finally. The words were quiet, but they landed like thunder. We just stood there, facing each other, the lamplight washing over us in gentle gold. The faint rhythm of the clock filled the silence between our heartbeats. I could see the pulse at her throat, the slight part of her lips as she drew a shallow breath. Her expression was a contradiction, part ache, part relief, as though she'd been holding her breath for years and had finally let some of it go. I don't know what this is, I said softly, but it feels like it's been waiting for a long time. Her eyes glistened, and she smiled faintly. It was a fragile kind of smile, one that carried both fear and understanding. It's not supposed to, she whispered. None of this is. I know. The space between us was small, 3 feet, maybe less, but it felt like the longest distance in the world. She took a slow step forward, then stopped herself, her fingers curling slightly at her side, as if fighting the urge to reach out. I don't want to ruin anything, she said quietly. Not for you. Not for me. You wouldn't, I replied. You couldn't. Her eyes searched mine for truth, for permission, for something that neither of us could offer. And then she did something small but unforgettable. She smiled, not the way she had earlier in the night, but softly, almost sadly. Some moments, she said, aren't meant to last. They're just meant to be felt. She turned slightly then, breaking the gaze, pretending to busy herself with the glasses again. But the air between us still pulsed with everything we didn't say. And I realized, as I stood there watching her in that dim kitchen light, that leaving wouldn't end it. Whether I stayed or not, something had already changed, quietly, irrevocably. When I finally stepped toward the door, the words she'd spoken still echoed softly in my mind. Some moments aren't meant to last, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that this one would. The world outside was pale and still when morning came, the kind of quiet that only follows long nights of rain. The streets glistened with puddles catching the first traces of sunlight, and birds began their hesitant chorus beyond the window. Inside, the house felt different, lighter, yet heavy with the weight of everything that had passed between us the night before. I woke early, sitting on the edge of the couch, where I'd eventually drifted off, still in the same clothes. The faint scent of her perfume lingered in the air, mixed with the soft aroma of coffee brewing somewhere down the hall. For a moment, I didn't move. I just sat there, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator, the distant kettle, and the memory of her voice. When I finally stood and walked toward the kitchen, she was there. Claire stood by the window, her hair loosely tied back, wearing a soft cream sweater and jeans. The morning light caught her face, tracing every delicate line that spoke of laughter, years, and quiet resilience. She turned when she heard me, and for a heartbeat, we simply looked at each other. Two people who'd shared too much and not enough, all in one night. "Morning," she said, her tone calm but careful. "Morning." She offered a small smile and motioned toward the counter. "Coffee's ready. You still take it black, right?" I nodded, stepping closer. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the space, grounding the moment in something familiar. But beneath that simple act, her pouring the cup, the quiet clink of ceramic, there was an unspoken conversation neither of us knew how to start. "Did you sleep?" she asked. "Not really," I admitted. "You?" She exhaled softly, a faint laugh escaping. "Barely." We stood there for a while, just sipping in silence. The tension from the night before hadn't disappeared. It had simply softened into something deeper, quieter. Not guilt, not regret, just a quiet understanding that something rare had happened, and that we'd have to carry it carefully. "I kept thinking about what you said," I began, my voice low, "that some moments aren't meant to last." She nodded slowly, her eyes lowering to her cup. "I didn't mean it." "Yeah, but—" I paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound foolish. "That doesn't make them any less real." Her gaze lifted then, steady and warm. "No," she said softly. "It doesn't." The morning light spilled across the counter, catching the faint gold in her eyes. I wanted to reach out, to touch her hand, to say something that would honor what had happened without breaking it. But she was already moving, placing her cup in the sink, straightening the sleeves of her sweater like someone preparing to step back into the life she knew. "You should go," she said finally, and it wasn't unkind. I nodded, setting my cup down beside hers. "I know." At the door, I turned once more. She stood there in the doorway, framed by sunlight, that same bittersweet smile returning to her lips. "Take care of yourself," she said softly. "You too," I replied. "And thank you for last night." Her eyes softened, and after a small pause, she said, "You'll make someone very lucky one day." The door closed behind me with a gentle click, and I stepped into the crisp morning air. The world looked the same, but it didn't feel the same. Not after her. As I walked down the street, her voice echoed in my mind, warm and steady. Some moments aren't meant to last. They're meant to be felt. And I realized that maybe that was enough. Some stories don't end with promises. They end with quiet gratitude for what was, for what will never be, and for the rare kind of connection that changes you even after you've walked away.